Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about making a prop class so we can have props to decorate our world. A prop is going to need its own texture as well as a world position and a draw scale so we know how big to draw the prop. We're going to talk about how to initialize members using inputs in the constructor. Let's get started. So we're going to create a prop class. Now, of course, the prop is going to need its own texture, so we'll use a texture 2D for that. It's going to need a world position, so we'll give it its own vector 2 called world pause, and we'll need to know how big to draw this texture, so we'll have a float called scale. So let's go ahead and create the prop class. So here we are in VS Code. We're going to go to File and New File, and immediately we'll click Save As and save this as prop.h. We'll go ahead and create a new file again and save this one as prop.cpp. Now in prop.h, we're going to declare a new class, and we're going to call this prop. Now we'll create a public section as well as a private section. Now the public section is going to have the constructor, so let's go ahead and declare that. And the private section is going to have some private variables. For one, we need a texture, so we're going to create a texture 2D called texture. And let's use braced initialization so it's initialized. Now we're going to need to include raylib, so texture 2D is defined. So at the top, we're going to include raylib.h. Next, we'll add another private variable. This is going to be for the world position. So let's make a vector 2 called world pause. And we'll use braced initialization here as well. And finally, we're going to add a float called scale. And we're going to initialize this to 4.f so we have an initial value. Now we also need the semicolon at the end of the class definition. So now we've defined the class and we declared the constructor. We need to define the constructor in the prop.cpp file. So the first thing in prop.cpp is we need to include prop.h. And next, we can define the prop constructor. So it's going to be prop with the scope resolution operator followed by prop. And now we have a constructor. We're also going to talk about how we can take input parameters for the constructor and use those to initialize member variables. Let's say our prop takes a vector 2 called pause, and here is our prop constructor. Now in the character class, we perform some calculations and use the assignment operator to give the character's screen pause variable a value in the constructor. So we could do the same thing here and take the input parameter pause and simply set the value for world pause here. But this is actually not the most efficient way to do it because world pause is already initialized thanks to our braced initialization. So we're using the assignment operator to perform a separate assignment to that variable. So what if we want to take an input parameter for the constructor and use it to initialize one of our member variables without this extra assignment step? Well, we can do that by the use of member initializer lists. You create them like this. First, you place a colon right after the parentheses in the constructor definition. Then, just after the parentheses, but before the constructor body, we initialize the member like this. Use the name of the member followed by parentheses with the input parameter inside. Here, world pause will be initialized with the value of the input parameter pause. No additional assignment will take place. This is the most efficient way to do it. Now, what if your constructor has more than one input parameter? Say we want a second input parameter of type texture2D, and we'd like to use it to initialize our texture variable. Well, the second input parameter gets initialized just after the first in a comma-separated list. Notice after we initialize world pause, there's a comma, and then we place the second input parameter. Now, it's important to note that these variables get initialized in the order that they were declared in the class itself in the header file. Variables are initialized in this order regardless of the order that you place them in the initializer list here in the definition in the source file. So it's generally a good idea to list them here in the order that you declared them in the class. So for your challenge, you're going to initialize some members in the prop class. Add vector2 and texture2d input parameters to the constructor of the prop class. Call these pause and text. Then create a member initializer list in the constructor and initialize world pause using the input parameter pause and initialize texture using the input parameter text. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, we're here in the prop header file, and I'm going to add a vector2 called pause and a texture2d called text. And we're also going to add these input parameters to the constructor definition here in the source file. Now we can add a member initializer list to use these values to initialize our members. So first we add the colon, and then we can initialize world pause using pause, followed by a comma, and then we can initialize texture using text. Now world pause and texture will be initialized. Excellent job. So in summary, we created the prop class, and we used a member initializer list to initialize the world pause and the texture variables using constructor input parameters for those types. We'll add more functionality to the prop class in the next video. I'll see you then.